Welcome to a Religious Education 5-minute recap video. We're in the exam board Eduqas. We are on the Applied Catholic Theology paper and we're exploring the Sin and Forgiveness unit today. We're going to be looking at Catholics and capital punishment, and I hope by today's session you are going to be able to explain those Catholic attitudes towards it. So firstly, capital punishment then, it is also known as the death penalty, and it's when a person is put to death for a crime that they've committed, and often this is reserved for the most serious of crimes. However, I want you to be aware that in the UK it is illegal. It was abolished in 1965. Lots of reasons for this, but there's one case in particular that stands out that I want you to be aware of. That's the case of Derek Bentley. Now, he was hanged for the murder of a policeman. Now, he was 19 years old at the time, but he was illiterate and he had the mental age of an 11-year-old. Now, with his accomplice, Craig fired a shot at the police officer and killed him, but Bentley was the one who shouted, "Let him have it." Now, the jury interpreted that as willful murder of that police officer, so they sentenced him, because he was an adult, to capital punishment. However, Craig, who was 16, he received 10 years in prison. Now, obviously, there's a public outcry here, and they felt very uneasy about capital punishment, because, if you look at somebody who's got the mental age of an 11-year-old, something doesn't feel fair and something doesn't feel right about that. Now, Catholics then and capital punishment, well, the attitude of Catholics has actually developed over many years. Initially, the Catholic response to severe crimes was one of retribution and protection. So essentially, give someone revenge and justice, but also keep others safe. And in the Catechism, it outlines that the Church does not exclude recourse of the death penalty. This basically means you can't rule out the death penalty if it's needed in certain situations. So if we develop onto that then and look at some Catholic support for capital punishment, St. John Paul II, he felt that capital punishment does provide protection. Now, in a document called Evangelium Vitae, it talks about capital punishment, how it should be avoided unless it is the only way to defend society against the most dangerous of individuals. Another book from the Bible is Exodus, and it says, you can take revenge on individuals. It says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If someone does something wrong to you, you can do that wrong back to them. So that would support capital punishment. Also in Genesis, it said, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. So if you cause harm to someone, you deserve harm to be caused to you. Again, supporting capital punishment. And finally, St. Paul, he says, it is the state's job to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Essentially, the state, we as people, are here to put God's justice into action. If someone does something wrong, then we need to hold them to account, and that could include the death penalty or capital punishment. However, all that being said, there is a lot of opposition to the death penalty, to capital punishment from Catholics now. Interestingly, even though St. John Paul II did sit there and say you could use it in severe cases, he does describe it as cruel and unnecessary. And think back to that Bentley case and how, mental age of an 11-year-old, does that seem fair? Some people would argue it seems cruel. Pope Francis, though, he said it is no longer justifiable. You could kill the wrong or an innocent person. And he outlines this. He says the dignity of a person is not lost even after the most serious of crimes. So essentially, you're made in the image of God. Even if you've made a mistake, even if you've sinned, your life is still sacred and holy. And capital punishment should not be used because it takes away that dignity. St. Augustine, he says dead people cannot reform, and you should hate the sin, not the sinner. Quite simply, if someone's dead, then they can't improve themselves and make themselves better and rehabilitate. Finally, in Exodus, it simply says, do not kill. So how can you justify capital punishment if killing and murder is wrong? Because it's just another form of murder. Now, if we branch out and we look into Jesus' teachings, there are plenty to use here. First and foremost, you could say love thy neighbour. It doesn't seem loving to end someone's life. However, we can also go into Jesus. Jesus actually changed that teaching of an eye for an eye, that revenge. He said, turn the other cheek. You should seek forgiveness. Jesus also changed do not kill to don't even get angry. Jesus understood that anger can lead to sinful actions, and often retribution comes from a place of people feeling angry and hurt and bitter, and Jesus wanted to remove that, so therefore capital punishment shouldn't be used because it comes from a place of anger. There's a famous example in the Bible. It comes from the adulterous woman. She had committed adultery. That's a capital offence. She deserved to be stoned to death, but Jesus stood in front of the crowd and said, let him without sin cast the first stone. Jesus is identifying that none of us are perfect, and therefore we should not judge other people. That's up to God. And finally, lots of famous parables, but the entire message of the gospel is to forgive and show mercy. And in the parable of the unmerciful servant, Jesus says, forgive 70 times 7, as many times as you can. Now, have a look down the checklist and see if you can link these key phrases or ideas to the aim of today's session. If you can do that, you've been successful. If you want to push yourself a little bit further, aim for these example questions and give them a go. Whatever you get up to, best of luck. Thank you very much for listening.